Hello there, I'm Raven Sinclair, and I'm here today for the first interview in my new series called Paranormal Perceptions. So glad you're here with us, either whether you're live or are going to watch it later. Do me a favor and click subscribe below. We have lots of fun conversations coming up. My guest today is Evelyn Hollow. She is a Scottish writer and paranormal psychologist, published in Haunted Magazine, Esotericazine, Corvid Culture, Spooky Isles, and others. She's a former psychology lecturer at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. She now consults as a paranormal psychologist and expert for various TV shows and podcasts, most recently, the smash hit show, The Battersea Poltergeist. Wow, can't wait to talk about that. She also gives talks on paranormal history and quantum physics of anomalous phenomena. Evelyn, thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
This is fun. The Battersea Poltergeist, I got to lead with that because, oh my goodness, I've had lots of paranormal experiences, and if I lived alone, I probably would not listen to it at night before bed. It was really something. But just to clarify before we kind of dive into that, you are an academic, obviously. But before all of that, what was your experience or your background with the paranormal, and how far back does that go?
Goes back quite far. So initially, I was sort of studying and training or wanting to be. I'm a forensic psychologist. I worked in a lab and things like that, and then I swapped to parapsychology at the tail end of my undergrad. And really, that was because I knew that it would keep me awake at night forever if I didn't. I had, paranormal experiences and things running right the way through my family, right the way back to when I was a kid. And they were always treated very matter of factly, as if this was just a thing that happened and we had to understand why. Um, and so I really believed that there would be a scientific explanation, or for at least some of it, and wanted to investigate it. And I didn't know how to go about doing that. And then I found out that the field of parapsychology, and I was unable to turn myself away from it, despite the fact that forensic psychology is probably quite a lucrative career. And becoming a parapsychologist was called career suicide by one of my professors at the time. And really, it's trying to sort of marry up personal beliefs and experiences with science. And I think it's different when, for people who have not had experiences, to then go into the science. So you have like hardcore skeptics versus people who have had experiences and they know they happen, and they've happened to hundreds of thousands of people all over the planet, right the way to the back, throughout history. The paranormal is perhaps the single greatest tenet of the human species, and had those experiences and then try to understand them scientifically. And I think as the years have gone by, more scientists from other fields have gotten involved with the paranormal. Everyone from physicists to biologists to aeronautics engineers have started publishing papers and writing books because they do think that there is a scientific explanation for paranormal phenomena.
Wow. Well, okay, so the Battersea Poltergeist, when you began the research on that, did did you find it beyond anything you had experienced, or did you find similarities? Did it, how did you find the whole, because it's, let me just say it did take place in the 50s. And so it's been a minute, but there were lots of notes and lots of records for you.
It's a monster case. It goes back 12 years. It's the holy grail of poltergeist cases. The Not just the time span is the longest running poltergeist case of all time, as far as we know, but also the level of phenomena involved, the variety of phenomena involved, the level of people involved. I think it's important to also look at like the backgrounds of people involved and who they are individually, because then, as a sort of forensic application, because then we would look at, well, what's motive for people to lie, or what's motive for people to hoax or embellish, and then we can rule things out. It was an incredible case. There are familiar things. Poltergeist cases follow a set order. So they're normally broken into 3 or 5 categories. I break them into 7. And this case followed, it had every single step in it and then some. So there are similarities. It begins the same sort of way with the noises. The poltergeist being the sort of noisy ghost, the spirit that knocks, and then escalating from there. It does have some more rarer things in it though. So you had there are cases of fire involved in poltergeist cases. There's been a few, but it is more uncommon.
Mhm.
Cases where deaths occur, there's been, I can only really name one off the top of my head outside of Battersea, the Battersea case. And we also had apporting and disapporting of objects, which does happen in poltergeist cases, but again, it's a rarer bit of phenomena. So there are some similarities to things I was sort of familiar with in terms of the noises and the pattern of escalation, especially. But there was definitely some really strange things, and then things we could sort of part explain away, and then other aspects of the phenomena. There is no to me, there is no scientific explanation for. It's not possible in terms of classical physics, and I think also the just the sheer density and level of phenomena. Like initially at the start of the case, we're not talking about normal, knockings on wall. We're talking about noises that were more than 180 decibels. People were out in the street thinking that the house was being ripped apart. And I don't know about you, but in terms of being able to hoax things like the Fox sisters being able to click joints, or anything like that, there was no way to create that level of phenomena with everyone in the house accounted for and nobody else in the house. A very small house, very cramped, lots of people in it, and the neighbors and police and everything else, and it's not possible. And phenomena occurring when Shirley, who was the focus of the case, wasn't there, or when lots of people thought that the brother John was involved in it, but he moved away to Australia very shortly into the phenomena, things like that. But yeah, just like more than 180 decibels. Like I don't know any poltergeist case where that level of noise has occurred.
Wow. Yeah, I found, listening to it, because there are two expert consultants, you and Kieran O'Keefe, and he's the more skeptical one, I guess we would say. And I found myself thinking, wow, he has a really hard job. His job's much harder than Evelyn's on this case. He did come up with some things, but yeah, it's just, if you have not listened to it, it is a BBC podcast. I'm going to just show the banner there so you can look that up, Google that, and get on that. It is a fascinating podcast. Okay, so the Hitchings family had a 15-year-old daughter named Shirley. We don't want to give away, we don't want to spoil anything, but this poltergeist did, or whatever this force was, did seem more attached to Shirley. Can you tell us, in your opinion, why that was, and why that seems to be a theme in hauntings?
So we do see in poltergeist cases that a spirit, or whatever you'd like to call it, would latch on more so to one person than another usually. And there's various theories of why this is. And one of them is that it's usually sort of a younger family member. So some people believe that it's because they're more open or more easily influenced. Some other people believe that it is because just sort of like energy attachment. They think that because it's usually like younger teenagers, they're more volatile, their energy is sort of all over the place, and they're still going through puberty, there's hormones, chemicals, things like that, and that they think that poltergeists latch on to that kind of chaos and fluctuation. And there is sort of another theory that it's really more about what communicates. So they believe that there's no voluntary way to have a poltergeist latch onto you, like it's not random selection. They believe that it's intentional, whether it's because that person tries to engage with it, or sort of extends a hand essentially, or kind of in some way wants to communicate with it. Maybe not like overtly, as in like vocally, but themselves, whether it's spiritually or personally or otherwise, wants to communicate with it. It sort of varies. They vary from more sort of spiritual end of to do with kind of your own psychology and spiritual awareness and vulnerability, right the way through, sort of psychical defense, and then I guess at the other end, in more scientific terms, we would, people would be looking at, well, why this person more than anybody else? And if it's unable to be explained in terms of psychology or sociology or culture or anything like that, um, then you would have to look at, well, what's different about them, physiologically? Is it their brain? Is it something? Is it a pheromone? Is it a form of something in their molecular structure? So we have to start looking at what really makes that individual um, more likely to be attached. And it's not the only thing. It's not that poltergeist cases only deal with that one person, but there does almost always seem to be a focus. So in the Enfield case, we would have the Hodgson, particularly Janet Hodgson, in this case Shirley Hitchings. And we can sort of go through these cases and see that it tends to focus on usually a sort of younger member of the family, usually a teenager or sort of preteen era. And yeah, there is lots of different theories as to why that happens, but it depends whether you're coming from a spiritual place or whether you're coming from the sort of high and dry kind of scientific place of what makes this person different. It's very difficult to test though in a lab, but there has work been done. So we often find it in poltergeist cases when a poltergeist interacts with an object, the object is altered. So we often find that there's weight change in object. So if you have an object that is thrown across a room by a poltergeist, we often find that when you then pick up the object, it's reported to be heavier. And this has occurred in dozens of cases going right the way back to the early sort of 1900s, right the way through. And one of the only scientific experiments that I could find investigating this, there was people at a laboratory at college who basically got a large weighing scale, like a platform, and had invited different people to sit on a chair, rock back and forth to alter their energy. Obviously, there's going to be a slight fluctuation from the sort of movement, but they obviously mapped this, worked out an average, things like that. So they got them to sit on a chair and they asked them, just change your weight. Just mentally, spiritually, paranormal, whatever, just change your weight. And of course, we don't expect anybody to be able to do it spontaneously. And then they would get them to rock back and forth to check that it's nothing to do with like their movement and things and fluctuations. So they did this with a completely random group of people so that it was a control. Nobody really knew what the experiment was for. But one of the people that was involved in it was Janet Hodgson. And out of all the people who were tested in the case, obviously Janet had no idea what was going on. She just thought it was a random experiment. Nobody else did either. Full control. The only person who was able to spontaneously alter their weight of any significance was Janet Hodgson. Her weight would fluctuate, sometimes by a full kilogram, and not just like for a second and then go back. We're talking for more than a minute. Basically, she was able to fluctuate by a kilogram. Sometimes I think it was at one point several kilograms for like a minute, and then it would go away again. And they couldn't work out, against controls, against other people, against rocking the chair. They tried everything they could to rule out confounding factors. And the only thing that was different about Janet was that Janet had physically interacted with a poltergeist. There's obviously famously, she was sort of, there's pictures and things of her levitating or being thrown or whatever. She was the only person who was involved with a poltergeist, and she was the only person scientifically who had altered weight that could not be accounted for by any other like classical physics means. It's the only test that I've been able to see where someone was able to do that, because it'd be really difficult for us to go and like email people all over the world who've been involved in poltergeist cases and get to test them and be able to do it, under real scientific conditions where they didn't know what was going on and things like that. Really difficult, but really, really interesting. It's the only only time I've ever seen it done in a lab.
Right. So so I can ditch exercise and spiritually lose weight. Some people can. This back to the Battersea Poltergeist. Harold Chibbins, who was the paranormal investigator back then, would love to have a conversation with him. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us, but he made a comment in one of the earlier podcasts that I thought was interesting. He referred to Shirley, I believe, as a battery for this poltergeist or this energy, and it reminded me of Reichenbach's odic energy, because that's referred to in some writings as, I think we have a little bit of an unstable internet. We're freezing, so I hope our audio is coming through. But Reichenbach's odic energy was sometimes referred to as a battery, and that emanated from all living things, and was affected by emotions and things like that. People could actually, draw it in almost like holding your breath, and that was from fear or skepticism, and then more openness would make it emanate farther. This is theoretical from his experiments, but what is your thought about the battery aspect and odic energy?
So to me, live in an old church, and the electrics are the worst thing. Stop flickering. That's really creepy. 1 second. There we go. I live in an old church with the worst electrics, and the lights always flicker, which is like that on cue. I'm just going to turn it for a little bit.
Okay.
So to me, odic energy is what I would call vitalism. So during both my undergrad and my master's, I did experiments, and I wrote my end papers on this. So we have this, what we believe there's a vital intrinsic energy to us as people, like a life force, essentially. So that is, to him, it was the odic energy named after Odin, the Norse god, and vitalism is in the vital spark, essentially. So these we've gone through and been able to, that these are older science, and that they're viewed now mostly as like pseudoscience, and they're controversial. But what we now sort of would view that is technically, to us anyway, or to me certainly, is consciousness, because it is, what is the intrinsic thing that makes us conscious, alive, as opposed to an object that is unconscious, not alive, inanimate, versus something that is alive but doesn't have consciousness. So how do we, if you look at like the coma scale and things like that, so at what point do we determine, is it simply brain waves, is it electrical, is consciousness located physically in a part of the brain, things like this. And so if you look at like Nagel's paper on the way in which it is like to be a bat, and then Chalmers as the hard problem of consciousness, we've been arguing about this for years, like where does that come from, what is it? And so if we sort of follow the theory that consciousness is not localized to a physical structure, and it's smaller and smaller and smaller, so we get down to molecular, and then we could go right the way down to particles, essentially. So if we start looking at it from that angle, some people might think that if you have a poltergeist or something that's non-corporeal, so it's made up of energy, is it able to interact with whatever ours is, whatever our non-corporeal energy, whatever our vital energy is, whatever what is our consciousness, essentially. There was a theory that these people are latched onto because, like you said, they're batteries. So essentially, they're whatever it is, whether it would be their life force, essentially, or is it their consciousness, or is it even as basic as like electrolytes? Like, who knows? Is that then powering this other entity? Is it drawing energy from it, as if the person is like a kind of power grid and things like that? So that's kind of where that theory comes from. And although I understand where that comes from, and in terms of like spiritual belief, it would make sense. In terms of the science, I do certainly believe that consciousness is not located anywhere physically. I'm of the kind of working theory, and I have been for a long time, that consciousness is either molecular or even further than that, broken down into particles. And the reason why we have things like ghosts or poltergeists or lots of various paranormal phenomena is because things that are that small are not governed by classical physics. They're governed by quantum physics, and quantum physics does the weirdest things. And we look at a lot of things in quantum physics and they behave like magic. Like entanglement, Einstein would call spooky action at a distance, because it looks like magic, and it's not. It's physics, but it's just that we're not quite there in understanding it yet. And so to me, if consciousness is as small as that, if it is broken down to the smallest building blocks that we have, then it makes sense that it would do strange things and behave in ways that look, inexplicable or, like magic, like fantasy, because they're being governed by a system that does things that seem to violate the way that we think things should act. It violates the way in which larger objects governed by classical physics behave. So it seems strange to us. I guess it would be difficult to understand. The questions would be, if a poltergeist is something that latches on to a person and then draws energy from them, what does it need the energy for? Is it so that it can sustain existing? Is it to replenish loss of its own energy, but then, energy doesn't decay? So why would it need to draw energy from it? And then also, I guess, if consciousness is broken right down to the smallest parts, when it absorbs other people's energy, if it is interacting with its consciousness, does it take some of the consciousness with it? Does it become kind of, melded together forever? There's lots of, kind of unanswered questions. It's really like a gender, why would a spirit latch onto someone more than anyone else? And I think, Chibbit does say that near the start of one of our first episodes. Shirley comes in and asks Chibbit, who the hell are you? And Chibbit's like, who are you, Shirley? Because why is this poltergeist so interested in you? Why you? Why is it being latched onto you? Why is it focusing on you? Why is it obsessed? But then if we attach human psychology to spirits, i.e. say that we believe that poltergeists are the spirits of dead people lived on, so they have their consciousness. They also have an agenda. So we're really just asking, why is a person obsessed with you? Why does anybody latch onto you? Why do you end up with a stalker? Things like that. Should we be looking at and assessing poltergeists in the same way that we assess, people, or the same way that we would assess in forensic psychology, crime? Why smash up a house? Why steal things? Why set something on fire? Do we need to apply I think sometimes we try and apply like non-human psychology, but if these things are remnant parts of us that have lived on, then of course they're going to behave in the same way that, a psychopath might behave, or a petulant child might behave, or in Shirley's case, or in several cases, like a stalker, like a really obsessive, abusive partner, because that's essentially, what the poltergeist was to Shirley. Smashed up the house, controlling, volatile. If it didn't get its own way, that is, it's a pattern of abuse that most, domestic abuse victims would recognize. So that is, human psychology in action, but in a non-corporeal way, essentially.
Wow. I know I had read a book years ago. It was written in the 1930s by a Catholic priest, and it dealt with his experiences with the paranormal. It was a fascinating book, and also mentioned odic energy and all of that. But one of the things that I remember from the book was the polarity of this odic energy, which Reichenbach said had a darkness and a light, as we all do, and that the more fear-based, I guess, endeavors or skeptic endeavors, the more polarized toward the dark or the lower energies, and I guess research that was involved more with the greater good was polarized toward the light energies. This is getting woo-woo. I know it's we're moving out of science, but I wanted to know your take on this, kind of, because I know one of the things that was mentioned in that book that I read years ago was that a lot of the energies, that non-physical energies that are out there, are that want to prove that they are here, that want to kind of play with humans, tend to be lower energies or more toward the dark side. And I just want to know your take on that.
So I guess it's a good question of like why, when we have paranormal experiences, are more of them negative? So why do we have like poltergeists smashing up houses and destroying things and setting fire to things? Why don't we have helpful poltergeists? But then we do also have people reporting, positive paranormal experiences where things like, ghosts of dead loved ones coming to visit them to pass on messages, or, to guide them. There's people who believe that they've been, saved by ghosts, that something pushed them out the way at the last minute of like a moving car or something. So you do have these experiences, but you do also notice that people always say that creating negative atmosphere draws in other negative entities. And so if you have a house filled with violence and volatility and rage and sadness and grief, all these things that we would put on the lower end of the spectrum or the darker end of the spectrum, then people believe that you are more vulnerable or inviting in spirits or poltergeists, things like that. And the upper emotions or the positive emotions like love and healing and self-acceptance and bravery and things like this and peace are almost banishing, that they're protective almost. And I think in terms of psychology, that's a way in which we look that the negative experiences and emotions lead us to strange and dark places. When people are in that state, they act out, whether that's in terms of like violence or crime or self-harm or suicide. And so those acts are inherently volatile and dark in themselves, where when you're at a place of peace and happiness and things like that, you don't tend to be back. The electric in this place are a nightmare. You wouldn't, you're deeply unlikely to act out from those places. So is it a sense of that we expect that to continue over into the afterlife or whichever? Do we expect the psychology to live on past us, that all those negative experiences and places will draw in more like a magnet, it will magnetize its same things? Is it law of returns? So will it draw in negative spirits? Will it draw in negative experience? Will it draw in violent things like poltergeists? Whereas will the more positive aspects draw in more helpful spirits, or or any other form of positive creature like brownies and things like that? So it's sort of looking at like the sort of magnetism of what draws in what, but it's hard to separate where the sort of psychology is us essentially attaching vitalistic, conscious properties to non-conscious items or inanimate objects, or also looking for patterns. Is it a case of when you are experiencing, depression or sadness or grief or anything negative, all you can see is depression, grief, and sadness and negativity, and sort of the opposite when you're happy, all you can see is other happy things. Sure. So it could just be a priming effect. I think making sense of that spiritually, in terms of theosophical or personal beliefs, I guess, is that the way in which people interact with their environment and the universe around them, does open them up to other things. And I think it's kind of a combination of both that psychology of kind of returns and your own belief in your brain of what you see and what you think is happening to you, what you see patterns in. But then I guess also, on the spiritual aspect, is there a kind of spiritual law to the universe where that lower energy, that negative energy, feeds back in and draws in only that? And so it creates a vacuum of that. Does it create more problems or more negativity for itself? It becomes like a self-eating kind of cycle, and it just gets larger and larger. I think it links back to probably the best example explanation of that comes from Native or First Nations beliefs. Everyone kind of knows the story about the wolves, that there's two inside of everybody. There's a dark wolf and a light wolf. One is like love and peace and happiness, and then the one is grief and rage and violence. And you'd ask, well, they're always fighting each other. It's good and bad, it's dark and light, it's ancient, it's yin and yang, it's right the way back to the dawn of the universe, and it's which one wins, and they always say, well, whichever one you feed, basically. And that is that is how that is how most people approach it spiritually. Approaching it scientifically, it's just in terms of magnetism and returns and energy and things like that. But I think more people, it's easier to understand just purely spiritually, essentially.
Oh, sure. Well, I know I've heard you talk about sort of the biases that we have as humans, and the classism really against those who have had paranormal experiences or are talking about them. And I was thinking about, excuse me, years ago, 2006, when I, was a single parent and was working all kinds of jobs. I did ghost tours at night. I live in a city that has a lot of haunted places, and that was one of my little side jobs that I did. It was fun, and I also had my own tour that I had created that was a women's history tour that I did in the daytime. And at first, I thought, oh, I'll tell these people on my history tour to come on my ghost tour at night. And that did not work at all because I immediately was discredited as knowing any history when I said that I did ghost tours. It was an interesting thing. I mean, their faces would change, and this is so perplexing to me because I've been guilty of it myself. I decided to go into a little more serious, serious work, still spiritual. I wasn't too serious, but I got away from sort of the paranormal investigations. But actually, this is an investigation into consciousness. It's an investigation into our own conscious evolution. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic. How have you been able to reconcile that, being on both ends? You kind of carry the torch for both. How does that work for you?
With great difficulty.
Mm,
The So I do believe that most of our paranormal can be explained in terms of consciousness and that we are getting there. When I was doing my undergrad and I started to think that consciousness was much smaller than we thought it is, that it's located right the way down into particles and molecular structure, I could not work out how on earth to prove that or to even start to run that in experiments
mhm,
or how anybody would go about doing that. And then lo and behold, like 4 years later, there was people who had done experiments with caterpillars. So they'd gotten caterpillars and they'd trained them to do certain things, sort of repeat behavioral conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning kind of thing. And then when caterpillars go into the cocoon stage, they liquefy inside. So it's not just that they change and, like shed and sort of grow things, they actually completely liquefy
mm,
inside. So there is no real physical, it's goop. It's literally just goo inside. And then that kind of recomposes itself and then you get the butterfly. So they did this and they found that once this caterpillar with the sort of Pavlovian conditioning and other things that they did to it and then tested it to make sure that they would know that it was that caterpillar, once it got into its cocoon and it completely liquefied, so there's nothing left of its body whatsoever, and then is reformed into a butterfly and emerged, the butterfly would do the same things as it did. Like we were able to show that it still had the same memory on Pavlovian conditioning that it did when it was a caterpillar. Now it can only have that if it has, so it had the same consciousness. It was the same caterpillar. It didn't like be reborn, a different thing. It had the same consciousness. It had the same memory. So that shows us that consciousness is not located anywhere in the brain and that it must be very small. It must be located, either it's individually or only when they're together, like a kind of cloud formation.
mhm.
So it has to work with all the components together for it to work, to interact with each other. It must be in a very, very small. And so once we'd shown that, I was like, well, if it is as small as that, then why are we trying to apply classical physics to it? Because we know that anything that is that small is governed by the quantum. And then once you start understanding it as being governed by the quantum, loads of like inexplicable stuff starts to make a lot of sense. Um, so even time, like when we think about ghosts and things, people would say, oh, why are they always like from the past? Why are they always from this era? Well, in terms, we know that things that are, if something is broken down to its smallest particles and this drifts out, so energy doesn't decay, we're remade up of everything. The universe is constantly just recycling itself essentially and drifted out. Could particles that are drifted apart across vast reaches of space still interact? And that is entanglement, or what Einstein used to call spooky action at distance. And in science we've been able to show that happening. We're talking light years of a difference. I think the Chinese laboratory is at the point of being able to show it with something that's almost as large as the human eye. So, you know, we're going to, something is so large that we're going to be able to see it with the human eye. So we're getting it on a bigger and bigger scale. So something on a much bigger scale that we can see is able to interact at the exact same moment as something thousands of light years away doing the exact same thing with nothing connecting them in between. We would see that and be like, that's paranormal, that's a ghost. And it is really strange, but it is just, you know, it is entanglement, it is quantum physics doing something really strange. And because it's across, you know, light years of time, what happens in one point out in space, what happens down here exists in two different times. So what up there is, you know, like 12 minutes could be 12 years on Earth, you know, things like that. So that kind of starts to account for, well, why do we have things that seem to pass through time? You know, why do we seem to have ghosts or spirits from the past and things like that? And a lot of and it's not like time travel, it's just that time in one place is different for time in another place. So what we perceive as being the past is not necessarily the past for them, you know, and vice versa and things like that. Time is, it's relative. And so, and I really do, you know, we are starting to kind of get there and understand that. We've got, you know, Rosenblum, who were like former top aeronautics engineers at Princeton, have, you know, published a book called Margins of Reality all the way back in the 80s, trying to explore this, because in their own work as physicists and engineers, they started to get to the point where they think that consciousness and physics and the paranormal might start to tie together. And they were sort of like looking at it. And I mean, that was all the way back in the 80s, and people were looking at it before then. Only now are we starting to get the technology where we're able to test it and understand it. And so I think for me, it is definitely explicable more in terms of, you know, consciousness and physics and things like that. But then it doesn't change the way you feel about things sometimes personally. And I think there seems to be an attitude that you have to either be like if you're a hardcore skeptic, you're rational, you're logical, you're scientific, you're infallible essentially. And if you endorse the paranormal, if you have any sort of paranormal beliefs, you're naive, you're uneducated, you're really foolish, you don't believe in science, things like that. And that those are two mutually exclusive, you know, camps that exist, and there's no way to be both. And then, you know, and like I've talked about so many times, the amount of classism and, you know, and also like racism and other stuff that goes on in paranormal, because the way in which we view other cultures' beliefs, we think, you know, oh, Western world, enlightened, scientific, so tribes in this faraway place that believe in this are uneducated in this and this, despite the fact that these beliefs are in every single culture, including ours, or any culture. I mean, certainly in mine, I'm Celtic, right the way through back to the start of time. You know, where do these things come from? And why do we also have beliefs, whether that's in like a cryptid or a power or a being of any sort, that existed in a part of the world and another part of the world almost identically and simultaneously, when these people would never have met? There was no way, we're talking so far back that there's no way to travel to these continents, or these continents have never interacted. And we can show that through anthropology and things like that. And yet they both exist simultaneously at the same time. So surely there's some sort of underlying, you know, thing, whether it was like, you know, an animal or a creature or a weather phenomena, whether it has a physical thing or whether it has a paranormal thing, it has to be an underlying belief. And I find it really weird that when we get things like poltergeist cases or ghost cases, people see them, if they occur in a rich person's environment. So, you know, like on a really expensive, like, you know, 1.5 million townhouse on this rich street to a rich family, it's treated one way. You know, the family's a doctor and they're lawyers and things, so they're instantly credible. Why would they lie about it? Whereas when the same thing happens to a working class family who might be partially unemployed, who might be in a cramped living conditions on a council estate, then automatically lies, nonsense, drama, doing it for money, doing it for attention in the papers. We automatically, before we've even investigated the phenomena, before we've assessed it, before we've ruled anything out, we've already created a bias about who is credible and who is not. And there's so much classist nonsense in the paranormal, and like you said about credibility and things like that as well. The attitude is that before we've even got to assessing it, they've already decided whether or not it is possibly real or whether it's even worth assessing, so that these people don't get the same level of treatment that everybody else gets. And you have people who they don't look at other cultures, beliefs, and think that's really interesting, like where does that come from, or don't want to investigate it or look at examples of it. They're just like, oh, they're not as educated as us. And it's just like, it's classist post-colonial, like white smooth brain syndrome nonsense that we think that or people think that they're more intelligent, and the more educated they are, they think on a graph that the more educated you are, the less you believe in the paranormal. But that's it's just not true. There are world class physicists who have written books on the paranormal and what they think it might be in terms of explaining it. And there are also people who are in the absolute tops of their field who hold spiritual beliefs or personal beliefs themselves. So it can be both. You can be a scientist and want to approach paranormal phenomena from a scientific standpoint and try and explain it, and still have personal beliefs that don't interact with that at the same time. And I'm class myself as Celtic pagan. I'm pagan. I'm a practicing pagan. But when I go to investigate things or consult, I'm there as a parapsychologist. Someone can ask me my pagan beliefs on it, and I'll give them it. But I'm there as a scientist, and the two don't interact, because who you are at work is not who you are in your personal life. And so trying to balance that is, it is difficult. It's not difficult for me as a person, because I think we have to work extra hard to not have bias and things like that. So I think we work even harder. We have the architecture to be aware of that and step back from it more than most people. But it's hard to navigate other people and work in the field if you come from anything less than like a hardcore skeptic. And also being female, and also being LGBT, and also being a ton of other things. So automatically, before my foot is even through the door, they don't want to listen to me, because I don't fit what they think a scientist should look like, or I'm a female and I'm pagan, so I must just believe in like New Age crystals and UFOs and Bigfoot and the whole shebang. And I'm like I can't roll my eyes far enough back into my skull. They're just not willing to listen. So there's already loads of barriers in parapsychology before you even get to like the classist bit, and then, well, how can you believe and be a scientist at the same time? It's an absolute minefield.
So many things, so many questions came up while you were speaking. I think a couple. One of them is, you live in Scotland. You grew up in Scotland. I've spent loads of time in Scotland, and I know that everything is haunted there. Everything has a ghost. Can you explain why some places seem to be that way? Is it collective consciousness that sort of accepts this and creates it, or is there something else going on?
Probably a bit of both. So there is, I live in Edinburgh, and in Scotland, Edinburgh is the city of ghosts. She's the paranormal capital of the world. She is the most haunted place on earth. And, people do ask, why? And it's a combination of, if we look at events, so if we, like we were talking about earlier, does trauma and grief and violence and these things draw in paranormal phenomena, then, it makes sense for Edinburgh, because most of Edinburgh is literally just built on top of dead people. And every single time they do something, so at the moment, well, for the last forever, they've been doing tramworks in Edinburgh. They keep having to stop because they keep finding skeletons. That is like classic Edinburgh. There's roadworks, why? Oh, there's more dead people today, and they've got to move the skeletons. It is built on top of dozens of plague pits. And then you also had the vaults, which was essentially like the underground lost city of Court of Miracles. And also its history of extreme, violence. So not just like gallows and the hangings and things like that, but also gravediggers, resurrectionists, the level of murder that was going on. But then you also had more And then you also got like ethnic cleansing and the Covenanters, which is essentially the world's first concentration camp. And it wasn't for Jewish people, it was for Scottish people, because Scotland has a history of oppression and the amount of genocide and ethnic cleansing that we've experienced. So, Joe, how could you not be haunted? The level of violence and grief. And then you also have more sort of paranormal aspects on top of that. So the witch trials. And also Scotland for most of its life, it's pagan country, so you also have interactions with spiritual interactions and history of that as well. So there's very few things that it doesn't have. It's also full of mythology in terms of pure creature mythology. Obviously Loch Ness is the most famous, but you've also got Will o' the Wisp, and there's werewolves, and there's vampire stories, and there's witch stories, and there's demon stories, and like you if you threw a handful of darts at a board of paranormal, like it's like paranormal bingo living in Scotland. So how, with that history and that trauma and that grief, how could it not have, whether it's paranormal phenomena and things like that? But it is interesting to look at, why places more than other ones. And it would be really interesting to find out, if we were able to take a controlled experiment and build a replica of like a really creepy looking house, and have one where nothing happened in it, and have one that is actually, a creepy house where there was like a famous murder or something, and then have people stay in them and then test them to see if they have experiences. Because some of it, like you said, is possibly, is probably collective consciousness, where we know the history of living here, we know the paranormal history, we know the violence and the trauma and the oppression as well. So is it that we automatically, when things happen here, do we automatically attribute it to the paranormal? I always say that any job interview I've ever been for in my entire life in this city, you can literally go in and ask, what's your ghost? Because everybody has a ghost. So when something happens here, something that we would deem spooky or uncomfortable in a building, other people might be like, oh, Edinburgh's ancient as well. She's one of the oldest cities in the world. So is it because much like the church I live in, the wiring is dreadful? Is it the plumbing? Is it, weird kind of environmental factors or echoes because of the odd structures? Everything in Edinburgh goes very deep underground. It's very odd. There's lots of also hidden catacombs and other stuff. So is it that? And instead of automatically going, oh, she's old, of course it's that, the pipes and stuff, we automatically go, oh, because it's Edinburgh, do we automatically go, oh, there's a ghost? Is it consciousness and priming because we expect it to be paranormal in Edinburgh, or is it because Edinburgh is literally paranormal as hell? It's like, or a bit of both. I think it's probably both. So
probably both. Well, we have a question, but before I get to that, I just wanted to ask you, what you think the difference is, and why there is a difference between sort of residual energy that some sensitive people might see scenes replaying, and actual, interactive spirit communication. What do you think? I mean, if you had to name the difference, or one existing without the other, what would you say?
I think when we talk about residual energy, it's almost as if we're talking about echoes. So we're talking about the faintness of something, traces of something. If you think of it in terms of another sense, so think of it in terms of like smell. If somebody was to spray perfume like right in your face, it's you're going to choke. It's right there, and it's going to be really strong, and then obviously smell dissipates out of the room. So somebody will walk around like, it smells like faintly like Vera Wang in here, like perfume or something like that. So is it like density and concentration? So when we try and look at somebody who is interacting directly with, whether it is something like a poltergeist or something that's said to be very powerful, versus somebody that perhaps walks through a place and hears a voice or has an impression of something faintly, like a ghost, then if we're still thinking of it in terms of energy, then I would assume it would be concentration and density. Then it's able to see and interact with something when it is loud, when it is strong, when it is powerful, versus when something is residual, it is an echo, it is a glimmer, it's just an impression, I think. And I don't know if it's more for people who some people are able to hear or see things that most people can't.
Mhm.
Perhaps because they're able to pick up a frequency that other people can't. The way that dogs can hear a dog whistle, it's silent to us, but they can hear it. It drives them mental.
Right.
And we are only able to perceive a certain amount of the spectrum. So, like cats and some birds and lizards and things perceive on different ends of the spectrum or have better sight, a wider range of sight than us, because there's colors we can't see, like infrared and ultraviolet and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, so are they just able to perceive something? So is it, if you are able to perceive it and something is faint, you only kind of get the impression of it that it's there,
Right.
versus when you're looking at it directly or hearing it directly, or it's concentrated. I would imagine it's that.
Well, okay, so this is interesting because I've never thought about it like this. So are you saying also that if there is what I would call residual energy there, that a scene, that something that happened in the past that someone can still sense, that if it's there at all, if even an echo is there, there must be consciousness. And so maybe if that person was more focused or more connected at that time, they could interact.
I guess so. It's kind of an idea of, if consciousness is broken down to its smallest particles, does it ever decay? So
Wow.
people
Hmm.
say, well, how come, people would often say to me, well, how come not everybody comes back as a ghost?
Uh-huh.
And for people who have religious beliefs, like they're Christian, they believe that people can go to one place and people go to another place, and then some people get stuck, essentially like purgatory. So that's kind of the religious explanation for it. And then in terms of the kind of physics of us trying to understand it, we'd have to look at energy. If energy doesn't decay and everything is just cycled back into the universe, and something is broken down to its smallest particles, then presumably it just becomes part of something else.
Mhm.
And the question would be, does each individual particle hold, consciousness? But it's really only our consciousness when it's all together. Do you know, like when it's assembled? So it's like having, you've got 4,000 components for something, and it only works when it's assembled together and all the components are together. If you're missing even one component, it doesn't work. Do you know, it's like a circuit breaker effect. So is it a case of, if consciousness can be shown, and we are, we're certainly getting that way, um that it's so small, we'd have to then look at whether or not each individual particle holds part of consciousness or all of it. Is it localized? Is it a cloud effect? And therefore, if that's the case, and it doesn't decay and it keeps going on and it's being recycled in the universe, then it becomes part of something else. So is that why people get impressions or echoes or sort of interact with things? Because they're interacting with part of the consciousness, but we only get more direct things like poltergeist, things that are really powerful, things that can like interact with physical objects that are, governed by classical physics, when it's assembled together. Like how can a poltergeist like throw a lamp? How does it become powerful enough to be able to do that? Like how can it exert the force? So yeah, we have to look at, particles that are able to. Is it a case of that it's not one individual one? Is it when multiple of them are assembled together, they then have a different ability? They then are able to interact on a much larger scale. Um, the same way that, a single drop of water has no force. If I drop it on you, you'll barely even feel it. But if I was to drop an entire Olympic swimming pool's worth of water on you, it would kill you.
Mhm.
So is it like that, where one thing does very little on its own? You can still touch it and be like, oh, that feels damp. Do you know what I mean? Versus when there's lots of it together and you are soaking wet. So, does that work in terms of an analogy, I guess?
It does, and I wonder, do you mean so that could be? Oh, and we'll get to these questions. We'll get right to these, but could that be in partnership with someone who is in physical, that is still in body? That could also be a partnership with that person to create enough energy to move objects and things like that.
Yeah, well, I guess so. So if that's if we, theoretically, if we endorse the belief that these things latch on to people and sort of use them as a battery, and we're trying to look at the motive. Why does it need energy? Why does it need it? Is it that does it need more more energy or more force or more particles or more matter, essentially, more density, more weight? Like, I don't know specifically what it is, but if it needs more of something, is that so that it can, it has the ability to exert more force? So that it has the ability to do things, and that kind of links back into the kind of theory of people who are focused on in poltergeist cases as batteries. But I mean, it's just still so theoretical. It's like trying to understand. I guess trying to understand the why is first, so that we can look at why that would happen, and why these things happen. But so difficult to difficult to test, essentially.
Sure. This is so fascinating. We could go on for a long time. I want to get to the questions. Hopefully, maybe you'll come back to go down some other rabbit holes in the future. But here's one. Is there one particular location that you would love to investigate? And if so, why?
I so originally, when we were filming for Battersea, I was actually supposed to go to the Enfield house on Halloween and be there for part of the case, but because of COVID restrictions, we didn't. I wasn't able to do it, so that would be fun. I think out of all the places, I don't know. Lots of people always mention the is it the Winchester Mystery House in the States? It's just really odd. I also love paranormal architecture. It's not just kind of the places or things that occur that make it paranormal, but you get these really strange buildings with strange things built into them, and really odd geometric designs and astrological designs and things that line up with other things, whether it's like ley lines or star patterns and things like that. And you're like, what does this do? I think, yeah, I don't know. There's probably a couple. I've kind of, I spent all of my time in Scotland going to different historical places. I spend a lot of time in graveyards. And I'd really like to go to probably like the catacombs in France. I love religious architecture. I really want to go to, kind of places like Rome and things, and look at their kind of religious architecture, and also their culture of, exorcism, and their kind of psychology of the paranormal and their religious beliefs and things like that. I don't think there's one place more than other, but big fan of really weird architecture, especially. But probably some in a couple in France, and definitely some in America, because America has kind of, America's very young, so it has a lot of like newer architecture, but it does still have some strange ones. I'd really like to go to the Cecil Hotel, because that is obviously world famous, not just spooky, but in terms of paranormal. But like we were talking about earlier, do places that are perceived as like evil or have a lot of terrible events draw another evil? If you wanted an example of that, the Cecil Hotel is about as intense as it gets. It's it's so world famous for the level of murders and horrible things that happen there. So why this place? Why this one goddamn hotel more than anything else has all of these events, happening? So I'd really like to, I think I'd really like to go there.
Did you see the recent documentary about the disappearance of, the
Oh,
murder or the death?
yeah. I used to
That
be
was,
really obsessed with those like YouTube videos when I was younger, trying to work out what the hell happened to her. But yeah, it was interesting. I really want just people to go back and not. Elisa Lam's probably the most famous, but it's got such an immense history. People have written books on it. I think there's at least a couple. And look at I think people don't grasp the level of stuff that's happened there. Like, I want someone to basically compile like a big casebook, but it would be like this big, filled with murders and violence and other stuff that's happened there. It's huge.
mm. Well, okay, we have a couple more questions. Why do you think so many paranormal investigators struggle to adhere to the scientific method in their investigations and research?
Probably because it depends on your definition of paranormal investigator. So I get asked this a lot, like, do I think that lay people, people who are not parapsychologists or things like that, should they be able, should they be allowed, like, I don't make the rules, should they be allowed to investigate things? I love that people go out and investigate things. I love that people are interested in, like, even their folklore or their local history and stuff like that. But we have a huge problem with people with no scientific training or background, and that doesn't mean a degree. Again, we talk about classicism and paranormal. It doesn't have to be like a degree on paper. We're just talking about like research, doing things like that, and any kind of knowledge or preparedness, but also kind of awareness of ethics and ethical practices in the sciences. Turning up to places and like egging on poltergeists to attack them, or breaking into really dangerous, like barely holding together structures, and running around banging things and whatnot. But in terms of the scientific method, I think but there's a lot of these people that are just doing this to try and get viral videos and and things like that, because it is a form of entertainment, and people are obsessed with the paranormal as entertainment. So there's not a lot of scientific method going on because they're not interested in scientific method. They're not interested in scientific answers or explanations. They're interested in capturing something on camera so that it can go viral, or so that they can show other people proof. But sometimes your proof is in your numbers or your stats, or that is the point of having that as science. The point of it is so that we don't have something happen and we can just point to it and be like, that proves that. Science is designed to disprove rather than prove, and we have to be able to test it again and again. It has to have replicability. It has to have a p-value of less than 0.05. That's not being employed when people go to investigate these things. So I also see a lot of people using random like tools that do stuff. Like I saw there was kids on TikTok who had like a filter, and they were like, oh, it shows you where there's like energy, and I'm like, does it? Because it looks like a psychedelic filter. Like, how does that have any, what does that do? Or I see people tossing these like light up flashing balls into rooms, and they're like, oh, when it like flashes, that means a ghost is near it. And I'm like, how did they, what is a ghost? Because what is that actually testing? Is it when it moves? Because that could be anything. Is it when there's temperature? Is it when there's a change? Is it like a carbon monoxide detected? Does it change a chemical in the air? Like, what is that actually? What is the input to the sensors of that triggers it? Like, what triggers the sensor? Because that is what you're testing for, not what a ghost is. It's just whatever the input is. So, there's just a big problem where I think it depends on the type of investigation happening. And some people are just going to just like document really interesting, like creepy places and just film it. That's fine. And some people, are like going because they want to communicate or egg on whatever they think is there so that they can capture it on film. That's unethical and dangerous. And being able to go in and ask questions and things is fine, but when people are like, oh, if you were there, like you'd smash something, or like, and I'm like what, like nothing good is going to happen. And then you'd have more investigations that are more scientifically rigid, where people want to go in and test certain things and then compare and then repeat it. But again, there is also difficulty because in lots of things seem spontaneous. People they see things that are fleeting, or something happens and then it doesn't happen again. It's only really in certain cases like poltergeist where we have repeat phenomena, and those are so valuable to us as scientists, as parapsychologists, because there's repeat phenomena, and therefore we can try and test it again and again and again to try and get more scientific results.
Wow, thank you. Stephanie has a question. Can you recommend easily understandable books?
It kind of depends what you'd like to read. So there is a really good book if you're interested in like quantum physics and consciousness. I know it seems like for a lot of people like a big, I'm not going to understand any of this, like too out there kind of thing. So one of my favorite books is called Quantum Enigma, and it basically will walk you right through from the start. So it'll start by just explaining things in quantum physics in a way that's understandable and digestible and accessible, so that you can grasp kind of, the basic things that happen. And then, it'll go in from there about experiments that are important, and, wave function. Why do some things appear as a particle and a wave? And explain all of that to you. And anytime it'll mention an equation or anything else, it'll break it down for you as well, so it's reasonably accessible. And then we will get to a point of talking about consciousness and then how those two interact. So I would say, yeah, Quantum Enigma. And in terms of just history of the paranormal, like just about like knowledge of paranormal history and, what are these things and cases, there's a really good book by Colin Wilson called Supernatural. It's quite thick, but you can dip in and out of it. and that does a really good. And it's I'm just trying to think of like modern books that are accessible, and that is quite good for being able to dip in and out and understand, kind of the history of where these things come from. And in terms of pure knowledge of like mythology and creatures and things like that, Brereton's Phantasmagoria is like my handbook. Anytime somebody mentions something I think I haven't heard, I go to it. It's like the encyclopedia of like mythology and cryptids and creatures and things like that. So it depends if you want to understand it from a folklore mythology perspective, or if you want to understand it from a kind of hard scientific perspective.
Mhm.
But if good understandings for like parapsychology, just look for like critical and conceptual issues. Anything that says like critical, conceptual, or historical, what we call CCHIP, critical, conceptual, historical issues, in parapsychology, because that'll look at like key cases and kind of key moments and key experiments and things like that. So, but also there's really you'll be able to sort of find them anywhere online, but it doesn't always have to be purely academic like textbooks. Just look for people who have written on paranormal. So like Colin Wilson has written lots of books. Brereton's Phantasmagoria. For science, Quantum Enigma. There's also a really good book called Margins of Reality. That's the one I mentioned earlier about the two aeronautics engineers from Princeton University who looked at, who then kind of took the idea of quantum physics and consciousness one step forward by starting to look at where it might link to the paranormal, like kind of odd phenomena, where that might explain it. That's also fairly it will get into it, but again, you don't pick it up and they immediately start going into the hard stuff. It will build through it. So yeah, I would also recommend that.
Thank you. Do you have are you working on a book, Evelyn? What's next for you?
I'm always doing like 5 jobs at once. I am currently doing guest spots on lots of podcasts and things like that at the moment. Getting ready to film a TV show for the Discovery Channel. There's also other TV shows that are kind of in development and things at the moment that are coming up. I think there's like potentially 4 I think I'm involved with. Podcasts and things like that. Getting ready to do other things and record more things, but at the moment it's TV and still writing articles for different publications. I have been working on various like books and novels and short stories, not even like non-fiction, like academically, because I'm primarily a writer before I was a parapsychologist, and I just have never gotten a chance to finish them because I'm doing like 5 jobs. I'm working on manuscript of short stories at the moment. I'm technically working on 2. There is multiple TV things coming. We start filming one very soon, like at the end of August, so you're going to have one pretty soon. There's also more like radio work and podcasts coming that I can't announce yet, and there is also potentially some other kind of in-person stuff happening. COVID, obviously, lockdown restrictions and whatnot coming, but there's going to be potentially kind of more in-person stuff as well. But yeah, I think people are going to be sick of seeing my face at some point very soon.
I doubt that. I doubt that. So I put your website up, and they can find updates and follow you there. You're also on social media.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. I post most of my updates on what I'm doing, kind of more career-wise on Twitter. Instagram is mostly me, like drinking and fanning about. But yeah, I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and my website is there, which I need to update because I kind of lost track of updating published articles, basically. But yeah, you can find me anywhere you would find anyone else.
You've been busy. Well, we look forward to what's next, Evelyn. Thank you so much for being here today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been really good fun.
It has been fun. And thanks to you for joining us, whether it was live or later. Remember to click subscribe below, and I'll see you next time.